Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this the clown decade, to the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today I'm going to do the thing that always annoys me and be put in a position where I'm probably going to have to end up defending the Tories quite a lot. I particularly wanted to wait until after the election before going into something like this, but I watched the introduction to this video and I wanted to cry. Because quite frankly, it was just so bad. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about Tom Nicholas's How Britain Became a Poor Country video. Now it's 40 odd minutes long, and knowing the way I do reaction videos, I'm going to have to split this up into 3 parts, and I've decided to do that from the very start. So don't worry, this isn't going to be a 4-hour monster that you need to watch in different parts. I will be releasing the parts as and when they are complete. I can't imagine part 2 will even be started until next week, because naturally, as hopefully you all know by now, I'm going to be doing an election stream on Thursday night, going all the way through until the early hours of the morning, until I basically want to die. Anyway, I was going to go into a bit of a section asking why does Tom Nicholas do this sort of thing, rather than just go to the mainstream media where they are basically just saying all the same thing, and then I realised he's got a Patreon and Nebula, and he's a leftist, and so everything was answered there. So I won't waste any more time on that, let's just get straight into the video. So after a quick introduction about Rishi Sunak calling the election, that being quite embarrassing, he starts getting to his actual points.
For a Prime Minister whose tenure had been, honestly, kind of forgettable.
I mean, I'd argue that's fairly subjective, but I'd say certainly the way he got into office alone is very memorable, at least for me, because you don't forget the fact that Liz Truss tried to come out and effectively completely change the paradigm of economic orthodoxy and get kicked out for the pleasure of attempting that, to be put in by someone who, I suppose you can say it's forgettable because, in terms of economics, he was literally putting forward orthodoxy.
It was even more apt for a political party whose 14-year rule over the UK has left the country in tatters.
I mean, I'll agree it's not been good, just picking out some quick stats for the moment. GDP per capita, which is a number I am no doubt going to have to bring up again and again and again, has barely even recovered to the 2007 levels just before the financial crash. Now, there's a lot of implications to that, many of which I'm sure I will get into later in the video, but to say that it's left in tatters, I think is a little bit left field. That's not particularly fair. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that these things obviously could have been much, 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 much better. However, Tom Nicholas is going to get into reasons as to why things are in quote-unquote tatters, and I have no doubt in my mind that they are all going to be things that have actually made this situation worse.
Poorer.
Again, as I went through with GDP, we're not poorer, we've stagnated. Or at least I suppose that completely depends on your time period, which I do hope that you will get into.
Nastier.
I mean, yeah, I would agree things have got nastier, but I think blaming that on Farage is a very silly thing to do. Again, Farage has been the victim of this sort of hatred. The deep banking scandal is obviously the biggest example of that. But by my estimations, left-wingers are way worse when it comes to the nastiness than right-wingers, which I think just comes down to the tone of the way these things are expressed. People don't like Farage because of his target, which is migrants mainly. However, he also constantly has a go at big business and, of course, the public sector, but barely anyone seems to ever recognise that. They just focus on the migrants. Whereas if you look at the left wing, Otto English is just terrible. As I went through with the question time video for Farage, you know, what was it, 11 out of 14 of the questions were effectively just people saying that they hate Farage. And then James O'Brien comes out with a book recently where he says how they broke Britain, and basically the whole thing is just exaggerated hearsay. He's basically taking rumours, stating them as fact, and then saying these people are terrible for it. Yeah, it's not Nigel Farage that's the nasty one here.
With crumbling schools, bankrupt cities.
I mean, the bankrupting city side of things, from all the research I've done into it, that's entirely down to the councils. Surprise, surprise, majority of them are Labour run, and some of the ones that are at risk of going bankrupt are Green run. And then, of course, there are some Tory ones. I'm not saying that they are free from that. However, my point being is that if you blame bankrupting cities on the Tories, I don't know what to tell you. I don't think it's their fault that the councils end up paying bin men more than they pay dinner ladies, and then the dinner ladies sue them. It's not my fault, and it's not the Tories' fault that they can't read the Equality Act. But even the crumbling schools thing is something that, again, I don't know why the Tories are getting the main blame for this. Reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, which is the type of cheaper concrete and quicker to install concrete that has been used since the 50s, by the way, which has caused some crumbling in schools because it has a lifespan of about 30 years or so, even less if it's exposed to too much moisture. It was a risk that has been known since at least the 60s. In the 80s, a report by the Institution of Structural Engineers revealed that short-term exposure to moisture reduced the material's strength by 13%, while long-term exposure to air pollution reduced it by 40%. And in 1996, a government-funded report by the Building Research Establishment also found that RAAC panels had been cracking in housing developments, and there were cracks and bends in panels installed in schools. So in 2003, Labour tried to refurbish all of England's secondary schools, but the Tories dropped it due to it not being cost-effective in 2010. However, the government still says that while there is no immediate safety risks, these panels should be inspected every year, because they know the risks. They knew they were going to crumble, and if they were found to crumble, they would deal with it. Which, surprise, surprise, they have been doing. It's just a really good story to tell that, oh look, the Tories have even made schools crumble. Which, according to the experts, which Tom Nicholas should be listening to, given I'm sure he trusts the experts, they say it's not really an issue that is UK specific. After being invented in the 30s, RAAC was widely used in Germany and other parts of Europe, in Japan and across Asia, and even in North America. Adrian Tagg, a lecturer in building surveying at the University of Reading and a practicing surveyor, also said that the UK isn't an outlier. Working in Belgium and northern France, I've seen RAAC in roof panels, which are load-bearing, and in facade cladding. So speaking only from personal experience, yes, you can certainly find it outside the UK in certain buildings of a certain age. In other words, all these things that are said to be unique to Britain are never unique to Britain. And in fact, we already seem to have procedure in place to actually stop this being an issue. Again, most of this video is going to be me saying, yes, things could be better, but you're acting like we're a third world country, which we're not. As much as I have many criticisms of the way the UK economy is run, and as many times I have been hyperbolic in the past in saying we're a second world country, LARPing as a first world country, it's simply not true. These problems are found all over the planet, and all your examples, I have no doubt, will be seen all over the planet, and this is why I have been pushed to make this video, because this came out 16 hours ago and already has over 250,000 views. I can't let you get away with these lies.
Polluted waterways.
Oh, I'm going to have to quickly go through this. Water privatisation, unironically, was the biggest success story of British privatisation. Long story short, the whole reason that this has become a news story is because we have started measuring pollution within rivers quite drastically and much more effectively since about 2016. There is a great thread by Steve Loftus on Twitter going through exactly why the mainstream narrative on British waters being some of the dirtiest in the world and being Brexit's fault and things like that are just complete and utter nonsense. But because it was brought up by Tom, I will specifically go through the sewage part of this. So there are 250,000 kilometres of sewers throughout England, of which around 100,000 kilometres is combined, meaning that the surface water, like rain and overflow, and wastewater, i.e. sewage, use the same pipe, and since the 60s, this hasn't been the case. All new pipes since the 60s have had them separated. But that means when it rains heavily, the system gets too full and the options are for it to come back up your toilet or into water bodies via these combined sewage pipes. All of these pipes have existed for 150 to 60 years. It's not a new problem, and in fact, it is a feature of the sewage system, not a bug. It's also worth pointing out that every sewage system in the world has these combined sewage pipes. England has just under 15,000 of the UK's 22,000 CSO pipes, and Europe has around 330,000 combined sewage pipes. The USA is a bit sketchy since it's done by state to state, but they think that 800 billion gallons of combined sewage are dumped a year in the US, so they're not going anywhere. They are not a problem that is going to be fixed overnight. But why is there an uproar when it comes to England? Well, it's because in 2014, Richard Benyon MP led a charge for all combined sewages in England and Wales to go 100% monitored by 2023, and when this was rolled out in 2016, there was only 5% of those monitored. And so this then leads to misleading graphs like below, where you can see that in 2016 it says, oh, there aren't many sewage spills whatsoever. Then you get further into the operation to make all of these CSO pipes monitored, And then you see, you know, it goes from 12,000 sewage spills to 403,000. And it's basically because we are counting these spills when we weren't before. And so, in fact, we can't use these numbers to say that there are more sewage spillages than there were 5 years ago, say, something like that. Because it would be like saying I'm 400 times fatter than I was 10 years ago, when 10 years ago you were only putting your hand on the scale rather than your whole body. And so when we get statistics that we can actually compare to before and after water privatisation, you can see that ammonia content has actually dropped since the 70s, quite drastically I'd add, but also biochemical oxygen demand in the water, which ideally would be 1 to 2 parts per million, has also dropped from just under 3 to just under 2 parts per million, and this was back in 2013. And he goes into further statistics comparing it to Europe and saying really our water is just as good or bad as the rest of Europe. But as I say, I was just going to go through these statistics quickly, and I went a bit overboard with it, and we've got a lot of video to get to, so let's get back to it.
And the highest housing to income ratio since the Victorian era.
I mean, that's probably the first statement that he's made in the video about the problems of the British economy that I agree with. I do wonder if he's going to actually get into what the issues are when it comes to the housing crisis. I imagine, like most leftists, he is going to finally admit that the supply side is a large problem with that, but I doubt that he is going to bring up immigration because that's quote-unquote nasty.
On aggregate, the UK remains one of the richest countries in the world. But it rarely feels that way anymore.
I mean, this is the part of the video where I say, well, obviously you just titled the video, How Did Britain Become a Poor Country for clickbait, and this is him basically admitting that. You're not poor because you feel poor. I think this point is best made by someone like Victoria Beckham.
We're very working class.
Be honest.
In the 80s, my dad had a Rolls Royce.
But having said that, certainly over the past 4 or 5 years or so, yes, the average disposable income per household has actually dropped. This might be why people feel poorer, but the reality of the situation is that due to GDP per capita being completely stagnant, which I know I'm going to have Jack in my comments saying there are better measures for it, but all of the measures that he brings up have completely stagnated as well. So I will continue to use it. But average wages have stagnated when compared to inflation. GDP's stagnated when compared in real terms. Productivity has frankly completely stagnated. These are reasons people feel quote-unquote poorer. It's because they're not getting anywhere in life. And if you're not getting anywhere in life and don't feel like you're improving on your wage ladder or something like that, you're not going to particularly feel like you're any richer, and if you don't feel like you're richer, well then you feel poorer.
Ask anyone that lives here, and they'll attest to the fact that everything is just hideously expensive now.
Yeah, that's a result of 11% inflation that we had 2 years ago. It's been brought back down now, so these price increases should be a hell of a lot less than what we experienced over the last couple of years, but this is exactly what ate into the change in household disposable income. It went down because of the inflation. And inflation is just another word for tax on assets that we all have.
Our politics is pretty openly corrupt and chaotic.
Yeah, I think I can understand why, but I don't think they'd use the same metrics I use for corruption.
And the country has been gripped by a general sense of malaise, an understanding that everything is just kind of bad.
Yes, and as I'm sure an awful lot of what this video series is going to be, I'm sure I'm going to have to pull out statistics saying, whoa, things are really not that bad and you are really blaming the wrong things here. I mean, already the examples of things that are bad that you've brought up are either not issues, nothing to do with austerity or Brexit, like literally 2 parts of this video are called, by the way, or are problems caused by the Tories that you actually want exacerbated because it will make you feel better, I have no doubt.
But how did we get here? How did a country which used to be a pioneer in science, technology, art and education come to have human poo floating down its rivers?
I mean, once again, the combined sewage pipes are actually a good thing. I would rather have this stuff be pumped into rivers than pumped back up my toilet. And again, most of our water is cleaner than it was 10, 20 years ago. Tony Blair was brought to the European courts, by the way, because the water was so bad in Britain. This has once again been one of those Tory success stories that they are actually pretty bad at actually advertising. It's a lot like the Brexit bus that I have no doubt we brought up. Yes, we sent that money to the NHS. It got 350 million a week and much more. But anyway, on the point of how we actually got here, I would say it's largely down to a few things. Our planning permission laws being absolutely ridiculous to the point where not only can we not build on derelict car parks, because apparently all NIMBYs say is, oh, I just want these green spaces protected, but we can't even build a relatively large, I'll admit, data centre covering 40 hectares, where the planners are also featuring an 113 hectare ecology park, which is the size of 174 football pitches, which will be fully accessible to members of the public, so green spaces can't even be built either. But NIMBYism isn't our only problem, and yes, I'm afraid I am coming after you this video, NIMBYs in my audience. But productivity in the public sector is completely stagnated, because trade unions in the public sector don't want any innovation whatsoever because it might threaten jobs, while demanding consistently higher pay despite this complete lack in productivity, whereas the private sector has barely been able to get even more productive due to overregulation and a complete disincentivization from the government for businesses to actually grow by constantly increasing corporation tax, having price caps in the energy sector, which means that they can't invest in even more power sources that are both green and renewable. Basically, we've red taped ourselves into stagnation, and I doubt any of this is going to come up this video.
And how do we come back from this?
Basically remove 90% of the laws that we have. You know, there's a reason that 9,500 millionaires have exodused from Britain over the past year. It's because they see the writing on the wall. There's no reason to invest in Britain, because productivity has just halted and we can't have any innovation whatsoever. You want more innovation in science? You want innovation in tech? Cut down the regulation, allow the institutions to build more research centres. Cambridge is strangled by this, by the way. And you will see Britain booming again, but people on the right want Britain to be a museum, and people on the left are worried that if you have rich people, that means that poor people will be poorer. Literally stuck between a rock and a hard place.
This is the story of how the British Conservative Party subjected its own country to 3 separate yet interconnected experiments.
It's quite amazing how we have stagnated from 2007, and the fact he's not even going to bring up the market crash, the financial crash of 2008, is actually staggering. Don't get me wrong, the Tories have absolutely gone in the wrong direction post-market crash. They should absolutely not have gone down the post-Keynesian route. However, once again, none of that is going to come up. Again, just for a little bit of a spoiler, there are 3 sections to this video, hence I'm doing 3 parts. One is about austerity, one is about Brexit, and the last is about COVID. Now, COVID is probably the only reasonable one that he is going to go through. The rest are just typical leftist talking points, where effectively all this video is a collection of mainstream left-wing talking points that have been put forward for the past 14 years. This is basically a video to catch up Zoomers to why they should hate the Tories. And Nigel Farage, of course. That is the only reason for this video, and it's what made me mad. Because it is such a simplistic view on the world, it is not going to improve anybody's intelligence or improve anyone's level of how informed they are. If anything, this is probably going to do the opposite. Basically, my point is, there have been some successes with the Tories, there have been some downsides with the Tories over the past 14 years. Overall, they have brought us back to our 2007 level, which I have to say is better than completely crashing the economy, but obviously not best case scenario. I am here to be fair to the Tories, but mainly to deconstruct all these lies he has put forward so far.
Each of which would tear away a different part of the country's political, social and economic fabric.
Good lord, this is going to be a good one, isn't it? Oh, at least I can get one of my favourite subjects of the past couple of years out of the way. We never had austerity. But carry on.
On the 11th of May 2010, David Cameron enters 10 Downing Street. His election win hasn't been a particularly convincing one. The party Cameron leads, the Conservatives...
I just want to say at this point that this video is very, very annoying to react to, because I'm having to cut out an awful lot of parts of this video that are, quite frankly, things that pretty much everyone watching this video should know. Even if you have Zoomers that don't know David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, if you are saying for the past 14 years we have had Conservatives in power, and then you cite a date from 14 years ago, You don't need to keep mentioning that he was leader of the Conservative Party. He's done it 3 times now.
Have only managed to win 306 seats in the House of Commons. Claiming the top spot has thus required him to go cap in hand to this guy, Nick Clegg, the leader of the UK's notionally centrist Liberal Democrat Party.
Notionally centrist? Are you... The problem with Tom is that he is going to say that the Liberal Democrats are right-wing, despite the fact that even at the time they were promising quite left-wing policies, the obvious one being the complete cut to university fees, which obviously didn't happen. But again, as I'm sure most of my audience will be well aware, if someone is saying that the Liberal Democrats are even centrist, they are obviously a leftist. The Liberal Democrats are left-wing, they have been for some time. Saying they're notionally centrist is effectively a way of saying, I want the Overton window to be so far left that unless the tax burden is twice as high as it is right now, then you are right-wing. Anyway, it goes on a weird tangent, overly explaining what a coalition government is. Again, this is the sort of thing that people should know. The last coalition government we had was DUP Tory under Theresa May. That was what? 6 years ago? Again, just grating because it gets nowhere near a point. This video is 40 minutes long. Already I feel like it could have been 20 minutes. And I say this as someone who regularly makes over hour-long videos, by the way.
As David Cameron crosses the threshold of number 10, however, he perhaps feels like this collaborative arrangement might serve him well.
Well, yeah, he can actually run the government with it. Of course he did. Again, you don't need a 5-minute explanation of what a coalition government is, and you don't even really need to mention the Lib Dems too much here to explain why you think David Cameron caused stagnation. Of course, what is obviously going to come up is austerity. Can you please get to it?
See, David Cameron is, at this point at least, a genre of centre-right politician which would soon go wildly out of fashion.
By having effectively the same rhetoric as Keir Starmer has these days. The Blairite and Cameronite fashion is still very much in place in both Tories and Labour. This is why this election is going to be voter apathy being the clear winner here. Calling him centre-right is, of course, completely laughable as well. As we will go through, he was probably one of the most left-wing Tories that we ever had in power.
He's certainly a great supporter of typical Conservative causes such as tax cuts, privatisations and reductions in welfare spending, but he's also desperate to at least present himself as youthful, environmentally conscious and broadly socially liberal.
Yeah, the man called himself the heir to Blair. Again, I suppose if you're a full-on communist or leftist, then yes, that would look centre-right to you, but no, that is very much left-wing and very much revolutionary. This is why an awful lot of Tory members ended up rescinding their membership during Cameron's premiership because, quite frankly, he was quite the radical progressive because he was trying to emulate Blair.
Some of this social liberalism is perhaps sincere. As Prime Minister, he'll soon push for the UK to adopt equal marriage, despite solid opposition from other Conservatives.
How do you write this script? Say, oh, David Cameron's centre-right because he likes some privatisation and some tax cuts. Despite the fact that, again, we're going to be talking about austerity, that doesn't include tax cuts. While one, I suppose, ignoring the tax cut bits, and two, openly saying, oh, he's very socially liberal and went completely against the Conservatives of his party. Yeah, man, this is really centre-right.
He'll also lead a revolution in offshore wind and had already managed to promote greater gender equality among political candidates within his party.
Yes, he also wrote about massively increasing the diversity of the cabinet. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. Cameron wanted more diverse MPs, and this was before he even got in as Prime Minister. Again, the centre-right candidate was, let's call it what it is, going fully intersectional, going fully postmodern left-wing whatever. As soon as he became leader of the opposition, he was trying to outflank Labour from the left. That is not what a centre-right leader does. Anyway, I've been reacting to a hell of a lot of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the economy. You don't need this much of a setup to say austerity was the problem. Cameron got in with Clegg. Like, have a bit of a profile on them, I guess, but this is just overdoing it.
Perhaps more suspect is the idea which sits at the centre of Cameron's vision for Britain, the big society.
Yeah, again, Margaret Thatcher, the most right-wing person known to Britain, saying that society doesn't even exist. Obviously, there's nuances to that whole statement and speech, but To move away from that to say, actually, I want more society, effectively what it's code for is bigger government oversight over how society works and how society's economy works. Again, not centre-right.
The big society is intended, in part, as a corrective to that eternal conservative bogeyman of big government. Cameron's pitch is that he's going to empower individuals, charities and community groups to take a more active role in civic life.
Like they were doing in the 1800s, like they were doing throughout the Victorian period, like they were doing also in the 18th century as well. This is how a lot of our big cities actually became big. The rich people of those cities were philanthropists for those cities. This is why I got irrationally angry at Black Lives Matter tearing down Edward Colston, because I think they found out he only made about 3% of his profits from the slave trade. Sure, that's bad. It was legal at the time. Let bygones be bygones. But my God, the amount of good he did for the city of Bristol is unparalleled as far as I can tell. Tearing that down because we hadn't quite evolved morals to slavery actually really bad and we need to end it everywhere. Yeah, I think you're crazy.
In its opposition to big government, however, the big society doesn't stop at cutting red tape and government oversight. All that charity work is intended to make up for a brutal programme of cuts to public services.
Here we go, the big spending cuts. Right, I'm not going to bring out my statistics yet, but I do have them in the sidelines.
It's fair to say that the UK's finances aren't exactly in the best of shape at this point. This is just 2 years after the global financial crisis of 2008.
Good. He finally brings it up. Yes, thank you. Please explain to me why austerity was a completely reasonable way to go here, and why Cameron was wrong for not actually implementing it.
In order to prevent the complete collapse of the country's banking and housing sectors, the previous government has paid to effectively nationalise 2 banks and shelled out to buy significant ownership stakes in 2 more.
Nothing wrong with the information here, but I have no idea why his editor has made... I don't know why the decision was made to make the background green, a kind of dark green, and then have a kind of dark grey silhouette of some of the banks that were nationalised. This makes it very hard to read. I'm not being funny, you have a Nebula and a Patreon, you have a lot of money. There is no way that you can proof watch this and think that that is okay.
A fall in real terms earnings, along with people being more cautious with how they spend their money, means tax receipts have also taken a hit.
Yeah, sure, that's true.
The state of affairs is perhaps best captured by a handwritten note left by Labour's outgoing Chief Secretary of the Treasury to his successor, which reads simply, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money."
I'd love to know what Tom's plan of action would be in this situation. What do you do when there is no public money? What do you do after a financial crash? Because if there's no money, this sort of thing needs to be paid for somehow. And if this can't even be done with the massive amount of borrowing that Gordon Brown did, along with selling off an awful lot of our gold, then yeah, we're in pretty dire straits. Again, I have many issues with Cameron, but in terms of economics, he was not put in a good situation and probably did what can be described as an alright job for the position he was in.
Not only does the memo help to portray Cameron's political rivals in the Labour Party as having a carefree attitude when it comes to taxpayer cash, the notion that the country is flat broke provides a rationale for taking a pretty uncompromising approach to cutting government spending.
Yeah, and I wish they did it. Again, I'm holding fire on my particular statistics. I want to see what he gets into first.
As things stand, the UK government is running a budget deficit of £150 billion. Cameron and his government unveil a plan to cut that number as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Your country has credit scores. If you keep staying in a massive deficit like that and you clearly have no plan to pay it back, your credit is going to be completely screwed and you're going to bankrupt the country quicker than most countries in Africa.
It doesn't matter that interest rates are at their lowest since 1694 and that the cost of the government's borrowing is effectively zero.
Ah yes, that's your plan. We've ended up having very low interest rates for a while and we've borrowed a hell of a lot and we've got into a financial crash. Clearly the answer is continue to have low interest rates and borrow even more money.
Cameron and Osborne want to slash the size of the state, and there has perhaps never been a better excuse to do so.
Oh, did they know? Well, why didn't they do it? Go on, give me your statistics as to how they slashed the size of the state. Tell me how this was Thatcherism 2.0.
The package of spending cuts implemented over the next few years includes reforms to the welfare system, which make it harder for disabled people and sick people to access support.
Trust me, with the people I know who are getting support, this is not true. I mean, hell, the system is so loose that in Bulgaria, £50 million of British taxpayer money managed to basically build a small town there because the system is so easy to be fraudulent on. These reforms were promised, some reforms were put in, we still basically have a massive welfare state.
It involves a 13% cut in funding for schools and colleges, as well as a 40% cut to funding for universities.
Yeah, the education budget was certainly one that took a bit of a slash, which is genuinely quite a surprising thing because now more people are going to university than ever, and our results are actually improving, so it's quite an enigma when it comes to education in Britain. But there is no doubt that when it comes to spending cuts, it's pretty much only education that you can point to and say, see, they lost money.
Made up for by shifting the burden of tuition costs onto students through a tripling of fees.
He's not going massively into student fees yet, but I swear to God, if he starts saying that that is a really unfair thing to do, I'm just going to point out, those fees don't actually need to be paid back. They only get paid back if you actually have an income above a threshold of, what, 20,000, something like that? And yes, the interest on it is ridiculous, but the idea of it is that the people who are making more money pay more of it off to subsidise the people that can't pay it off. It is a system that is so student-sided it is ridiculous. You are only punished, quote-unquote, if you are hyper-successful anyway. This is not America. You do not keep the debt your entire life, even if you go bankrupt, and you technically don't actually need to pay any of it back. It is a ridiculous thing that people in the UK think it is unfair. It is so ridiculously student-sided, I don't think I'd rock that boat, because it would be way too risky.
Anyone working in the public sector has their pay frozen for 2 years, and subsequent annual pay rises capped at 1%.
There's a lot of people in the private sector lose their job. Hell, my brother lost his job. My dad ended up having to fire about 20% of his workforce. It was horrible times. Most people in the public sector did manage to keep their jobs though, but this was the deal. Again, I'd love to know what the alternative is though, Tom.
Police funding, defence spending and public transport spending all receive swinging cuts, whilst the Royal Mail, the UK's postal service, is sold off to investors at a bargain basement price.
Okay, so he's brought up spending, but not in any massive detail. There's certainly no figures on the screen. But here is the real-term spending over the past, 30 years, something like that? As you can probably see, the 2010 incoming of these massive cuts is hardly even noticeable. As I say, it's mainly education and defence spending that took a big hit. Public services generally stagnated, started going down during the COVID pandemic for obvious reasons, because it was being replaced by economic affairs, which include the furlough scheme. Healthcare steadily got more and more money. I think 1 year ending in 2013 took a cut, and that was it. That was it. And social protections actually just go up and stay there. Again, these social welfare reforms that made it harder to get benefits, no, it did the opposite. It was easier to get benefits. Again, as I constantly say, where is the austerity? Education took a hit and defence, that was it. Okay, let's take a look at overall spending then. Wow, take a look at this real-term spending cut. It went from, 780 billion to 770 billion? Well, I'm not going to go out of my way and say, yeah, obviously there was no spending cuts whatsoever. There was some. The problem is that it went down to 2006 levels and then just stayed there. Now, the point of using real terms is so that inflation is normalised and we can actually make direct comparisons. The problem is with anyone talking about austerity, all they ever mean is spending cuts. You can tell because he's not even gone into the tax hikes that were put in. And two, the whole narrative is, oh my god, look at these spending cuts. Clearly, it went back down to like 1980s level or something, but no. It just went to 2006 and stayed there, which is in line with the economy as a whole, which is where the biggest problems come in, but he's not even going to touch on it. And to be cynical, there's a reason he's not giving us any specific figures for these cuts. It's because there's no way you can claim that austerity happened with the figures I've just shown you.
It's hard to get across in just a short section of one video quite how wide-ranging Cameron, Clegg and Osborne's attack on public spending is.
I'm not being funny. I just went through it in, 2 minutes. 2 minutes I went through to say, wow, look at that. Education and defence took a bit of a hit. That was it. 2 minutes to get up the real-term figures of public spending and go, wow, look at that. It completely stagnated. This is so slimy. The whole reason he is not going into detail on this is, one, he's wasting a lot of time having to tell people that David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, and two, because there's not actually figures you can go into. This is why all he's citing is The Guardian and BBC. Because you actually do proper research and actually look into the numbers on this, you realise, wow, yeah, austerity didn't actually happen. Or at least it did if we're only referring to tax rises, but absolutely nobody, especially in the mainstream, say austerity and mean tax hikes.
There's not a single part of British public life that goes untouched.
Investment in social protection and health went up or stagnated. To say it got cut post-2010 is so absurd I'm not even going to entertain it. Oh, everywhere was affected. Yeah, in some ways positively.
And judged on its own terms, it's pretty successful.
By 2015, the deficit has dropped by more than a third. Nevertheless, the effect on the economy and country more broadly are mixed.
The tone of this video is so strange. He has to basically admit sometimes that austerity worked, while at the same time saying austerity was so bad that it made disabled people lose all their money and die. Again, he's not gone specifically into spending cuts and the detail on that, because again, you can't make the argument that we had austerity. Oh, sorry, again, I have to be very specific here. When he says austerity, he only means spending cuts, hence he hasn't touched tax hikes.
Throughout the 5 years of the coalition government, George Osborne repeatedly tells Brits that, quote, we're all in this together when it comes to this attempt to fix public finances.
Yeah, I'm not particularly shocked he had to say that when spending as percentage of GDP was at its pre-COVID, post-Thatcher peak of over 45%, and then it's generally gone down back to, oh, wouldn't you know it, Blairite levels, which, by the way, because it's a percentage of GDP, the only reason that's actually happened is because we've had millions of immigrants a year coming in and increasing the GDP while stagnating the GDP per capita. Oh, and don't worry, immigration's going to definitely be coming up as well.
Nevertheless, the pain of austerity is felt strongest by the poorest in society.
How much free stuff were they getting? Again, he's not even touching on tax hikes here. This is all about spending.
In fact, at the same time as work for ordinary people is becoming more precarious and less well paid, corporation tax, the tax paid by companies on their profits, is gradually brought down from 28% to just 20%.
Oh, I'm sorry, he does talk about tax, but he doesn't talk about any of the other massive tax hikes that we got post-2010. No, he only brings up corporation tax, which, guess what? Corporation tax is generally seen as the tax you do cut when you go into a recession, because according to all sorts of current economic thought and research, and one that I largely agree with, supply-side tax cuts are aimed to stimulate capital formation. If successful, the cuts will shift both aggregate demand and supply, because the price level for a supply of goods will be reduced, which often leads to an increase in demand for those goods. The National Bureau of Economic Research studies the persistent effect of temporary changes in US federal corporate and personal tax income rates. According to their recent 2022 working paper, a corporate income tax cut leads to a sustained increase in GDP and productivity. In contrast, personal income tax cuts trigger a short-lived boost to GDP, productivity and hours worked, but have no long-term effects. In other words, he didn't do his research, he just said, oh, they were just trying to make the rich richer by cutting corporation tax. No, they were trying to improve GDP and productivity, because that's what cutting corporation tax does, and that's what increases your tax receipts. Because you have more people making more money, then you can get more of that money in tax. I mean, honestly, just looking at the UK tax burden as a percentage of GDP, clearly post-2010, we did not have this massive cut in taxation that we saw post-Thatcher. No, we obviously saw it pretty much staying at the same levels and increasing even, to obviously try and offset the deficit. Again, their main target for trying to offset the deficit was actually by using migration, but we've not quite got into that yet.
By 2015, the grim reality of Cameron's big society is evident in the rise of food banks.
Oh my god, again, I've got to defend things that are obviously good. Food banks are fine. I don't understand what the left's problem with it is. All it is charity. Effectively, if you are poor in the UK, you will be referred to a food bank if it is deemed that you need to make use of it. The whole point of it is, is that it is a short-term help for people to be able to feed themselves and their family until they can get on their feet again and provide for them again. It is a perfectly reasonable way to do charity. And they actually work pretty well because they are pretty well used. The big society is working when people are doing charity work like this.
5 years ago, food banks had been essentially non-existent in the UK. The country's most prominent food bank charity had handed out just 40,000 packages that entire year. But by 2015, that figure has risen to more than 1 million.
Oh, again, this is just a complete regurgitation of mainstream narratives. There's no research gone into this. He just read The Guardian and BBC and is just collating their articles together effectively. But anyway, on screen on the left here, we have the number of food banks in the Trussell Trust network from 2005 to 2020. And then on the right, we have the number of food parcels that they have given out. As you can see, by both a mixture of increase in supply and, of course, increase in the use of food banks, because again, these have to be done by referrals, and food banks were pretty much the main way that people were getting food if they were in dire straits due to being homeless, having a benefits delay or change, something like that. Clearly they could still eat. Again, this is actually a success. This is a good thing. People end up in bad situations. It's really good that, one, not only people are willing to help with the food bank situation, because again, this comes through from people buying food in a supermarket and putting it in a food bank collection box to be distributed by the network. This is absolutely fine. This is private charity with the help of government funding and government advertising and government procedure, basically eradicating malnutrition in the UK. And oh no, there's a big problem with that. The big problem, as it turns out, is that it's not all being done by the government. That is all this comes down to. This is not a socialist answer. People aren't starving. What more do you want?
The result of Cameron's policies, then, is not some utopian empowerment of local communities, but one in which people who previously could have found support and guidance in the welfare system becoming reliant on charity to feed themselves and their families.
I cannot tell you how annoying that sentence is. I am actually half raging at that, and it's something I constantly ask to socialist friends of mine. Why does it matter if it's the welfare state or private charity that is helping people in need? Why does it matter to you? Why does it matter if it's government that paid for that food or other people? Seriously, why does that matter? But then he goes on to say that, oh, it's not the welfare system helping them, it's private charities, when with food banks, you are only allowed to go to a food bank if you have been referred to it by the welfare system. So you have to go through the welfare system before you even get to the private charity anyway. Again, the only point of this video is to say it's actually capitalism's fault, let's go socialist. Which is just a crazy thing to say with the public spending statistics that I have given you so far, along with the fact that he is not even touching tax other than to say, oh, they did the completely reasonable and suggested thing of cutting corporation tax when they went into a recession. Even Labour cut corporation tax. It's left-wingers know to do this, for God's sake.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, as the impact of Cameron and Clegg's cuts begin to be felt, there's a sense that these policies might not be super popular amongst the general public.
Man, I can't believe after the post-war consensus where everyone expected massive amount of Gibbs, taking away some Gibbs, even though they were barely taken away, was seen as unpopular. Again, no research got into this, no actual look at the numbers, just a complete regurgitation of the same narratives we've heard for the past 2 decades. It's unbelievable. I'd say it's unbelievable. It's completely believable. The man's lazy.
The coalition years are beset with protests and strikes and demonstrations by various groups affected by the austerity regime.
Yeah, trade unions are really good at constantly striking, I do agree. This was why it was an absolute blinder by Margaret Thatcher to privatise everything. Not only did it improve everything, but you barely saw any strikes again, because people were paid at market rate.
And if it's easy to disregard such activists as a vocal minority, the notion that UK voters might be experiencing a touch of buyer's remorse quickly becomes evident in the polls too.
I mean, you can say that, but they were in power for 14 years. People were generally okay even with the false narrative of austerity, because people understand having a massive deficit is not good for the country's economics. And if it resulted in a note saying we're out of money then yeah, people are definitely not going to be trusting of Labour to carry on with the way they were going.
By the end of 2010, the Labour Party has overtaken Cameron's Conservatives in the polls, a lead they maintain consistently for the next 4 years.
I'm not being funny, but if you put that directly simply down to austerity being a problem, you're being a bit short-sighted. As you can see on the screen, this is party polling from May 2010 to May 2015, from one election to the other. Now, as you can see, from the start of 2011 to the start of 2012, yes, it's fair to say that Labour were more popular than the Tories, down to possibly austerity, budget cuts, tax rises, whatever. To say this was the reason maintained throughout the entire 5-year period is just disingenuous. If you look further down, you'll see a rise in this purple line that is UKIP. UKIP, who weren't exactly known for being left-wing on economics, and certainly were not known for being left-wing socially. In fact, generally they were full of dry old Tories. And in fact, this is the main reason, similar to today actually, why the Tories were underperforming when against Labour. It's because their vote was split. It's not correct to say that austerity was unpopular for all these years. Clearly in 2012, the public were at least coming round to the idea or didn't care about it as much. And in fact, with UKIP rising, that's probably the European Union and immigration debates taking hold. People moved on to that. Labour were above Tories because UKIP were eating into the Conservative vote. Again, the narrative being put forward by Tom here is completely false and a complete misreading of the statistics to say so. I love videos like this.
The right-wing press mercilessly lampooned the Labour Party leader, Ed Miliband, for his slightly meek, awkward aura, including through publishing this unflattering photo of him eating a bacon sandwich.
Yes, he indeed never recovered from the bacon sandwich debacle, but trying to say, oh, the right-wing press lampooned... He lampooned Ed Miliband for being a meek and not very leader-like figure, when he kept bringing up Guardian and BBC articles, basically being slimy and lying about the statistics of austerity. You know, the amount of power that the right-wing press have in Britain, I think, is largely overstated by a lot of leftists. But the tone-deaf accusations that they are the only ones that character attack or misuse statistics is just ridiculous.
Nevertheless, while Labour's polling lead drops, they still retain a slight lead.
This has actually very little to do with why Britain is poor or putting forward that thesis in any way. This is just a quick history lesson of 2015. Look, Cameron gets in again, he gets in with a majority.
When the results are counted, the Conservatives turn out not to have lost support, but gained it.
Yep, that's absolutely true, and they lose their minority government. They are now ruling with a majority. Are you going to actually explain why that happened?
Everyone involved in the entire polling industry spends the next year or so hanging their heads in shame.
Yeah, and they're still getting it wrong. Honestly, I reckon something similar could happen on Thursday. Obviously, the next part of this video I may have to address what I'm about to say, but Reform could overperform in terms of people who vote for them, because there's so many people who just... I mean, I had it recently when I was with a group of friends. I didn't once mention that I voted Reform. I was fine talking about Liz Truss because you can kind of meme that. But you have people, though, do the typical thing of, oh, they just don't like the Browns, or just send every foreign back, even though they're probably foreign as well, blah, blah, blah. No nuance to the debate, and honestly, I think it's less that people like that are not willing to be insulted. I think it's just a lot more that there's no point trying to talk to someone like that. And so, yeah, this has been a problem with polling for the past decade, really. This is what caused Trump to get elected, and no one saw it coming. Obviously, the Tories in 2015 here. Brexit as well was a massive one, and hell, pretty much the rest of Europe having a resurgence in the quote-unquote far right. People like Tom and other people in the mainstream have absolutely no introspection of why that's happening, and yet they keep going on the same old playbook of obfuscating statistics, lying about narratives, and pretending that left-wing institutionalism simply doesn't exist, despite the fact that this guy is doing nothing but quoting the BBC and the Guardian, pretty much saying the same things. yeah, there's a reason for that, and it's not because they're honest.
Among several proposed reasons for why they got it so wrong is the so-called shy Tory effect. This is the idea that some voters, when asked, will be hesitant to admit that they're going to vote Conservative. Presumably something about not wanting to appear pro-food bank and declining life expectancy or something.
Yeah, I agree, they should be more loud and proud about it. Food banks are good. Life expectancy, like most other things, stagnated post-2010, but guess what? That's more than likely to happen once you reach a life expectancy age within the 80s. You know, this is not the type of thing where you can have exponentially increasing trends on. Saying life expectancy came down is just a complete lie. And once again, as I say, I don't think people really care about being insulted. There's just no point talking to someone like you when you are not willing to have any nuance in the conversation, or even willing to maybe think that the other side might have a point. To make it clear, I'm going through this entire video seeing what your points are. So far, you're just lying about them. Like, this is me addressing your points. You have no interest in addressing, say, mine.
Cameron exits the 2015 general election more confident than ever. He has a reassuring sense that there might be greater support for his austerity agenda than there sometimes appears.
He's still ignoring one of the massive reasons that they ended up with a majority after the 2015 election. It's amazing that he's circling around this so much, but he does end up bringing it up.
That confidence is about to be undercut, however, by a new threat: the rise of the Brexiteers.
I mean, I'm going to end the video here. That is part 1. Brexit can wait for part 2. And so he may bring up that actually Cameron did get into office in part due to promising a referendum. But he is right. The Cameron legacy simply cannot be talked about without reference to the Brexit referendum. And yes, the rise of the Brexiteers. Again, we had a lot of shy Brexiteers. This was another issue. Does this man have any introspection when making a video like this? And, maybe I should have more nuance in this debate and see what their points are? No, of course he doesn't. He just wants you to hate the Tories and go full socialist. Because, as I say, he doesn't understand economics, and after going through this video, that was probably not the best title for it. But hey, the description will make up for that, I'm sure. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the first part of this video series. The next one will be out, I don't know, you might be lucky, it might come out before the election. But on that note, obviously, big election stream coming Thursday. That crime guy has set up a small quiz for the guests, whoever's on in the chat. I'm not sure who's going to be on. It's a bit of an open door policy, but people know about it and can have the invite on if they appear in my Discord. Tonight, it's the other side of the hill. We're having our hopefully last black-pilling pre-election Tosh Talks, talking about what we think the political landscape's going to look like in 2029. And then, of course, Regional Variations will be on Wednesday, where I can have a bit of escapism from all that nonsense. And, of course, outside the streams, videos will still be made. You get this one today, you got one yesterday, you may even get another one this week, who knows? But obviously, it takes work and time to do these things, so I do implore you, please do support the channel any way you can, just giving it a like, comment, favourite, subscribe, sharing it about with whoever will be interested. Does great work. Obviously, you can become a member as well if you enjoy watching the live streams. You get most of your benefits there from the extra emojis and things like that, which I should really add to. But aside from that, simply watching the video is more than enough. I just need to shill every now and then to remind you that actually there is more you can do to support if you so wish. But anyway, with that, that is everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.